Hi, I'm Stephen Prince, talking about Django, Sergio Corbucci's hugely popular and influential movie. This first scene derives from Akira Kurosawa's Yojimbo, which opens by framing the wandering samurai hero in a tight shot from the back as he travels a lonely country road. Sergio Leone plagiarized Yojimbo in making A Fistful of Dollars, and Corbucci shows us that they weren't done yet with Kurosawa. Django is also a riff on Fistful of Dollars, which had been tremendously successful. In both films, as in Yojimbo, the hero wanders into a town split by two warring gangs and has to find a way to survive the madness. Where is Django's horse and what happened to it? We never find out. Carrying a saddle? Yeah, that makes sense in a Western, but dragging a coffin is far out. It's the kind of bizarre humor that Corbucci loved. When they shot this, Franco Nero says Corbucci kept saying, "Go on, Franco, go on, keep walking." So Nero did. It was winter and raining, and when he turned around, Corbucci and the crew had all gone home. Nero was a good sport, and they continued to work well together on other films. The assistant director, Ruggero Deodato, who'd go on to make the legendary Cannibal Holocaust, said that Corbucci got the idea of dragging the coffin from an Italian comic in which a character was doing just that. But it's also a surreal touch and not the only one in the film. That coffin is what literary scholars might call an objective correlative. It personifies Django. He drags death with him and dispenses it throughout the film. He even suggests that he resides in it. When he's asked what it contains, for example, his answer is Django. Rocky Roberts' ballad, sung a bit like Elvis, is a traditional Western element. You found that a lot in many of the Hollywood movies of this period. And these American lyrics, these English lyrics, did appear in the original Italian print. So there goes Nero dragging that old coffin through this desolate-looking, muddy landscape. Corbucci had wanted to shoot the film in snow. In fact, he wanted it to be a kind of Western in reverse, in which the hero would not be riding a horse, and instead of a prairie landscape, you'd see a lot of snow. But he couldn't do that in this film, so he settled on having a very muddy kind of landscape. Very harsh-looking, very gray, wintry, not your usual opening for a Western. So it is a kind of transformative opening. It's a very perverse way to begin a Western, at least within the context of a Hollywood movie. This is a great zoom. It's one of the best that I've ever seen. Nero stands up on the edge of that little rise there, and we frame him at the bottom of the shot, but then as we zoom in, very gracefully done, we're going to reframe the action so that he stands more in the center of the composition. Very nicely done. American critics reacted very negatively to the violence in the Italian Westerns, and so too did the censors in England, where Django was banned altogether. This scene gives us a good illustration of what they didn't like. Maria, well played by Loredana Nusiak, is savagely brutalized, tied up, and whipped. This lurid extreme violence goes well beyond anything that could be depicted in that period on American or English movie screens. American Westerns in the mid-60s were quite tame and moralistic, cleanly distinguishing between good and evil, and like Hollywood movies in general, they insisted that good would ultimately prevail. Think of all the John Ford Westerns, for example, like My Darling Clementine and others, in which women were really the kind of moral center of the films. They personified the most civilized and progressive values. John Ford would never have had a scene like this in any of his films. It's far too perverse. The Euro Westerns that erupted with Fistful of Dollars and were continuing in spectacular fashion with Django upset all the guideposts of the clean, ordered, moralistic world of Hollywood Westerns. In this regard, the American critics of those days got things wrong. They dismissed these films as cheap imitations of the Hollywood Western. In fact, these movies were radically reinventing the Western and taking it in startling new directions. By the end of the 60s, for example, it was Hollywood that was imitating the Italian Western. Sam Peckinpah's The Wild Bunch, for example, is unthinkable apart from the context set by the Euro Westerns. So Jackson's men now make this dramatic appearance garbed in red. As we will learn, they are Southern racists, former Confederate soldiers still fighting a race war they view as an endless conflict. Like many of the best Italian Westerns, Corbucci's film is upfront about issues of race and class, and he would continue to pursue these themes in later films. Those red hoods worn by Jackson's men have one point of reference in the Ku Klux Klan and its hatred for African Americans. In this film, their hatred is directed at Mexicans, the closest non-white group they have available. So now we've got something even more barbarous than what the Mexican thugs were about to do to Maria. They're going to burn her. They're going to tie her to that cross and set her on fire because she has crossed the color line, because she's been cavorting with Mexican men. So their plan is an expression of racial hatred, which comes out of the history of the American South and is given this twisted manifestation in the Western. Now, Django's waited a rather long time before he intervenes. Again, this is not something an American hero would do. He seems almost a little bit reluctant to get involved, but now he's got to, because he's been on the right side. He's fought for the North, and presumably one reason he did that is that he was involved in the anti-slavery cause. In this regard, Django becomes Corbucci's extension. His moral conscience tells him that slavery is wrong, and thus when Django fought for the North, it was in some part due to his opposition to slavery. Throughout the film, he shows that he's very aware of social injustice and the nature of predators and the need to stop them. This kind of speed is very typical of the Italian Western. The bodies pile up almost immediately, and the hero is able to dispense them about as fast as he can pull the trigger. One of them is not quite dead yet, and we're going to see Django get rid of this guy in rather the way that Clint Eastwood had done in the first two of Sergio Leone's Dollars films, which had been made at this point. Look at that spindly bridge. This year, 1966, when the film came out, Sergio Leone was at work on The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which has another spindly bridge in it that Tuco crosses in a memorable scene. Django's remark about it's not time yet to cross the bridge is kind of an enigmatic remark. What does he mean? Later in the film, it appears that what he means by this is that he will find a way to free himself of the past by crossing the bridge. This is a great shot. This moving camera shot across the dimly lit, muddy street of the unnamed town that has virtually nobody living in it or no social life. Now we meet Nathaniel, well played by Angel Alvarez, a prolific Spanish actor. Look at the depth of field in this shot. He walks into the very background to the end of the bar, gets a little beer in that mug and sends it on down the bar, where the prostitute picks it up. The other prostitutes behind her are a little bit out of focus, but watch as she walks over there to him. We get a very nice rack focus that brings them into clarity. And then Corbucci just holds the shot a bit as they stand at the back of the frame before he then moves into some close-ups that give us clearer views of who they are. And we get a few shots. Corbucci likes to play things in master shots with deep focus. And I find that a very pleasing approach to the filmmaking. Alvarez gives a very soulful performance as Nathaniel. He brings a lot to the character that is not written out explicitly in dialogue. This is the Western town set at Elio's studio just outside of Rome, and we've got a brilliant production designer Carlo Simi, and a fine cinematographer, Enzo Barboni. Together they make the town tremendously visual and atmospheric. The gray skies and limited light came from the winter shoot, and it was a challenge for the filmmakers to work under those conditions. But these things add so much to the aura of doom that saturates the film. Now look at this shot. Wonderful deep focus. We frame Django and Maria walking to Nathaniel's saloon at the end of the street through the slats of this hitching post and the implement, the tool that's hanging there from the post. It's a great shot. And then we go to the interior, and again we've got one of Corbucci's elegant master shots where we get to see any number of things happening at the same time. In Keoma, one of the great later Italian westerns, directed by Enzo Castellari, Franco Nero reprises the action of this scene where he tries to find a room for a victimized woman. One of the most unusual things about Corbucci's movie is that it was shot in the European widescreen ratio of 1.66 to 1, rather than the more extreme Techniscope ratio that Italian westerns in this period generally used. As a result, the actors have a lot more headroom, and the deep focus compositions seem more striking. Corbucci covers a lot of the scenes in wide compositions that accommodate the multiple actors, instead of cutting constantly to close-up the way movies do today. And you can see that strategy paying off nicely in this shot here. The 1.66 ratio facilitates Corbucci's preference for working in master shots. Look at how nice that hat looks on Franco Nero. Nero reported that Corbucci spent a great deal of time finding just the right hat for him to wear, and it sure does look good on him. Its curvature fits the lines of his face extremely well. Nero was just 23 when he made the picture, and they added some lines to his face and some beard stubble to make him look older. He was not the first choice for the role. Mark Damon was considered for the part, and that same year he starred with Corbucci in Ringo and His Golden Pistol. Corbucci and producer Manolo Bolognini considered Nero, Damon, and a third actor, and Nero was chosen because he seemed to photograph the best. And indeed, there are numerous shots in the film where the camera simply gazes almost adoringly at Nero's beautiful face, often in profile. Nero really didn't want to do the role because he wanted to be a legitimate actor. He wanted to do more highbrow movies, but no role did more for his career or his international fame than this one. The art direction in this set in Maria's room tells us a lot about the distance between the Euro-Western and Hollywood. Notice how old and worn the furnishings look. Italy and Europe are a more ancient world than the New World of America, and towns in Hollywood westerns often look squeaky clean and newly built. So Simi's production design here gives us an elegant statement of the old world that the Italian westerns are coming out of, in contrast to the newness of America on the western frontier. There's a nice shot of the street, once again showing us the Ilios film set. And now we've got a scene where Nathaniel lays out the situation in town, tells Django what's happening and who's who. It's a scene that derives directly from Kurosawa's Yojimbo, by way of Fistful of Dollars. In Yojimbo, the innkeeper, Gon, gives the samurai the lowdown on the town. And in the two Western remakes, our heroes, Clint Eastwood and Franco Nero, listen silently and stoically to their innkeepers, just as Toshiro Mifune did in Kurosawa's original. So we've got a perfect circle here. Kurosawa's film was a riff on American westerns. It influenced the Italian filmmakers, and their work was picked up and imitated by Hollywood in pictures like The Wild Bunch and numerous others that emulated the Euro westerns. Look at the way Nero acts with that hat. keeping his head down so that what we see is the hat. And then every now and then, like here when the camera moves in, he lifts his head and we get to see his face. And Nathaniel walks off, and we get a nice shot of the prostitutes back there, and then we're back to the hat in front of Nero's face. Now, one of them gets up and comes over and tries to be nice and engage Django. Probably she's got a business transaction in mind, asks him to buy her a drink. But the significant thing about this encounter is that she's eventually going to ask him about that coffin that he's dragging, because it scares people. And she wants to know what's in it. Specifically, she wants to know whether there is a body in there. So she's going to ask him, is there somebody in there? And when she does, it elicits a music cue emphasizing Nero's response. He pauses, we get another shot of the coffin, and his reply, a man named Django, is poetic and startling. As he drags the coffin about, he brings death in his wake, and now we understand that he is death, at least in the sense that he feels he has nothing left in this life. So where does his bleak outlook come from? The really great thing about Westerns is that the hero doesn't need much of a backstory. Because gunfighters like Shane or Django or the man with no name are abstract figures of mystery, they become mythic and archetypal. Certainly the Civil War has played a major role in his despair, and Italian Westerns typically show war in a very different way than how it is treated in American Westerns, namely as a slaughter fest without the trappings of glory and patriotism. If Django is animated by a spirit of death and loss, much of that certainly derives from the war, as it does also from the loss of a woman whom he has loved. This woman was perhaps his wife or his sister. The details are vague and we don't really know. But she was killed by the racists, and so her skin likely was dark, and this may be why she was attacked. It counts for a lot that Django wears a northern uniform and fought on that side. As I've speculated, he was probably involved with the anti-slavery issues. These things distinguish him clearly from Jackson and the other racists. So throughout the film, Corbucci is emphasizing the topic of race and racial hatred. Note, for example, that the women at Nathaniel's are a mixed-race group, and that one of them has openly referred to Jackson and his men as the racists. Conjoined with this is Corbucci's almost spiritual interest in rituals of suffering and expiation. The tortures visited upon Django and upon his hero, Silenzio, in The Great Silence, enable them to achieve a purification as they stand and fight on behalf of those who need help. These rituals of suffering reach a delirious climax at the end of Django in the graveyard shootout between Django and Jackson, and Corbucci takes them up again in his great Western, The Great Silence. In that film, like Django, the hero's hands are destroyed by the villains. In that film also, Corbucci depicts an interracial love affair with great tenderness. His interests in racial animosity motivated him as well to make two classic political westerns, Compañeros and A Professional Gun. So Django asks for a deck of cards, and we get this nice deep focus shot with Nathaniel there at the back of the bar. She tells him what he wants. Nathaniel comes forward and gives Django those cards. The coffin is prominently displayed there in the shot. And Django doesn't give Nathaniel an answer, just stares at him rather sullenly. Now we get some nice off-screen sound that is serving to introduce Major Jackson. It's the setup for the shocking scene that follows. We're told that these things are terrible that's going on. And Now we get this striking cut as the victim falls forward into the camera in that deep focus shot. The scene introduces us to the villainy of Major Jackson, who's played by the Spanish actor Eduardo Fajardo. He enjoyed a career renaissance in Italian westerns, typically as slimy, silky villains, and he's very effective here as a smugly arrogant white supremacist. As we've seen, the Jackson character personifies the racism of the American South, and he may have a resonance for Italian viewers that goes beyond the United States' history of racial oppression. Jackson is very wealthy, he's got a hoard of gold, and he's made a business alliance with the Mexican army. He works both sides of the U.S.-Mexico border, and he profits from each. The alliance of wealth and state power that he represents, and his violent campaign to intimidate, scapegoat, and terrorize social undesirables makes him into a quasi-fascist, transported back in time to the 19th century. And as filmmaker Alex Cox has pointed out in his book on Italian westerns, Jackson's target practice here was an actual ritual carried out as recently as the 1950s against Brazilian Indians by their white slave masters. This scene went on to become a very familiar element in Euro-westerns. Scenes like this, where hostages are shot for sport, also appear in Full House for the Devil and Adios Sabata, as well as in Via Rides, an American production that was shot in Spain and was clearly influenced by the Italian westerns. The music score that we're hearing is by Luis Bacalov, and it provides a powerful commentary on the action. Bacalov avoids the ornamentations and flourishes that Ennio Morricone was noted for, so we don't get any of the whistles or the trills or the ostentatious choruses that are familiar from Morricone. So although the score here involves more traditional instruments than Morricone's work, I think it works extremely well for the film. Bacalov is not well known among audiences in the United States, but he was extremely prolific during his career, writing scores for more than 160 movies and television shows. Django was his first Western score, and his fine work also appears in A Bullet for the General and The Grand Duel, whose theme Quentin Tarantino reprised in Kill Bill. Although Alvarez's performance makes Nathaniel seem amiable and amusing, Nathaniel is a bit of a monster in his own way. Indeed, this whole film is full of monsters. Nathaniel is content to do business with Jackson and to pimp out the women who work for him equally to Jackson's gang and to the Mexican gang led by General Hugo. He even takes them across the border into Mexico every week, where they service the soldiers at Fort Chiriba. And when Django is about to meet Jackson's entire gang in the street outside for a showdown, Nathaniel says it would be best if Jackson killed him immediately, because Django would feel no pain, and we'd all lose fewer customers. Nevertheless, one of the great things about this movie is that characters like Nathaniel and Django and Maria have a depth and a dimension to them that goes beyond what one normally expects in a Western. Nathaniel, for example, by way of Alvarez's performance, has a depth of sadness in him that suggests that he is a fundamentally humane character who has nevertheless found himself involved with a bunch of bad people. In this scene, Corbucci emphasizes Jackson's racism in his exchanges with Django. Maria betrayed our race, he says, by going with the Mexicans. And Django's reply is going to be that the war is over and those things have gone out of style. So now this guy tries to put the make on the dark-skinned prostitute. And she asserts that he doesn't own her, which elicits this slap. And Django intervenes, as he did with Maria, on the bridge. And there's a face you see often in Italian westerns. They didn't quite get focus in that shot where Jackson restrains the man. It's a little bit soft. Nice camera move over to the table as Jackson comes forward to confront Django. And Jackson refers to the dirty northerner So he feels animosity toward Django not just because he's killed his men, but also because he's a northerner. Jackson spouts some nasty racist bile, and Django replies that the war is over, and those things have gone out of style. This reply connects the Western with our own more recent period, where the Civil War indeed has long been over, and overt racism has become unfashionable, but its tradition and its heritage remain quite strong. Jackson's remark that for us it'll never be over gets at the undying nature of the poisons that he represents. Indeed, its history of slavery profoundly deformed American society and continues to do so. More than 150 years after the Civil War, it is still very dangerous to be a black man in America. Django ridicules Jackson by suggesting that his racism even includes the vultures in the air. But then, getting serious, he calls Jackson a Southern pig, a political scorn that goes well beyond the terms of Hollywood movies that have tended to treat the Southern cause in romantic and sentimental terms. Corbucci will have none of that. Jackson is a monster, and what he represents is monstrous, and that's exactly how Corbucci shows him. We've just seen Django's speed. It's impossibly fast. He even got the guy directly behind him. Sergio Corbucci loved humor, and he's having a lot of fun giving us these grand displays of gunplay. And Franco Nero really sells things with his dry, nearly deadpan performance. Even when he shows off with a gun twirl, it's dry and laid back. He never hams things up, even when Django is doing outrageous things that are way over the top. It's a really interesting performance, very different from Clint Eastwood's in Fistful. Eastwood moves through the gunplay in that film like a sleepwalker. That's how Leone described his performance. By contrast, Nero is very subtle and nuanced. He gives Django a range of emotional shadings that convey degrees of loneliness, anguish, and longing that Eastwood's character wouldn't begin to feel or to show. Plus, Django has a social conscience. He finds Jackson's politics hateful. Although Corbucci and Nero were reprising a lot from Fistful of Dollars, the character they created is compelling and original. No wonder that more than 30 movies followed about Django or with his name in their title. This is an interesting scene with Maria. Django kind of goes back and forth in terms of the degree to which he wants to become entangled with her. She thanks him in a very heartfelt way, and Nero walks away from her and tells her he didn't do it for her.
I didn't do it for you.
Of course, he's keeping Jackson alive for his own purposes.
I don't know if I should have saved her.
It's not for me to say.
And this is an odd sort of piece of dialogue that Maria wants a man to protect her. In all other respects, she seems to be quite robust and self-sufficient and knows what she wants and knows what she doesn't want. But her words seem to have affected Django because he comes forward and is willing to help her construct this illusion that he's a man who will be relied upon to protect her. A slow zoom in and a fade. And we're out in the street in this wonderful production design from Carlo Simi. Django comes out dragging the coffin, and we're getting into a sequence now where viewers at last are going to see what is inside that coffin. One of the film's most memorable details. Now look at this nice camera move away from that log, away from Django, and we're going to bring into the frame, rather unexpectedly, Nathaniel standing here. So we've got a really nice deep focus composition that Corbucci has given us by way of a camera move. It's a very well shot film. No town in a Hollywood Western ever looked so muddy as this one. The one in George Stevens' Shane came the closest. Hollywood's western towns always have a spirit of community about them. People are living there, socializing, building their lives. This sense of community is what gave Hollywood's movies their optimism, their sense of historical progress, of a brighter future. Of course, that sense of progress was founded on manifest destiny, on taking the land from those who were already there and exploiting it. Corbucci is not under those illusions or in the grip of that ideology. Like many of the Euro-Westerns, Corbucci's film strips away American optimism and belief in historical progress. This town is a run-down, decrepit, crumbling hellhole. Nobody lives here or builds a life. There are no community spaces. Religion exists in terms of Brother Jonathan, but there seems to be no church, certainly not one that anybody attends. Nobody lives here except for Nathaniel and his prostitutes. Corbucci gives us a bleak, bleak world, stripped of hope and ideals, and Carlo Simi has conveyed it so brilliantly in his set designs. All of this lies well outside and beyond the moral coordinates of Hollywood's westerns. Nathaniel here tries to persuade Django that it's foolishness to try to confront Major Jackson's men, and there's that selfish motive. If he finds you here, he'll take it out on us.
But Jackson won't be content just to kill you. He's going to kill us all.
There's nothing to be afraid of.
That's a nice framing of Django sitting there on the log. Placed a bit back from the camera, giving us a sense of space and place. Alvarez brings a real hangdog quality to the character of Nathaniel that makes him sympathetic, even though he's really not such a nice guy. So he's got to go report back to them that he's not been able to persuade Django to behave in ways that will serve Nathaniel's interests.
Listen, Nathan, if you could go and warn the Mexicans, it would be easy.
She gives him an opening, suggests a way that he could behave honorably, but Nathaniel's not ready to do that. By the end of the film, he's going to have a change of heart and actually help Django and Maria. But at this point, he's got to hope that they'll kill him right away. He'll suffer less and I'll lose fewer clients. The height of selfishness. Now look at this shot coming up there, where Django is framed between those railings. It's very poetic. Of course, it's a point of view shot from Maria's perspective, but it's still a very poetic image because what it gives us is a visual statement about Django being entrapped by the past, by his traumas and scars, and also by his obsession with the gold. This is a nice build-up. All these graphic elements, the skeletal scaffolding, the lines of the fence posts and the tower etched against the bleak winter sky, and the deep focus here, extreme deep focus. Django in the foreground, the men in the back, and again here, a deep focus shot, the riders coming in. There's a great sense of place and pacing and build-up. A zoom in. And now the Red Hoods come out, and there's Brother Jonathan. Ruggero Deodato made a funny remark about all these Red Hoods. He said it's because the extras were especially ugly. All the good-looking ones had gotten jobs in another production, so we put their hoods on to hide their faces. At the same time, it's a very smart decision by Simi and Barboni to play up this contrast with the drab surroundings. If the KKK wore white as a symbol of purity and the white race, these red hoods illustrate the deeper meaning of the KKK symbolism, namely blood and terror. Brother Jonathan exalts in the blood to come. His religion blesses the righteousness of the powerful and celebrates the necessity of a blood sacrifice, made to ensure the sacredness of white power. And those burning crosses that we see evoke the KKK terror in the American South. So Django waits and waits, and the audience wonders why, as this gang of red hooded thugs closes in. But then we get one of Corbucci's great, grand, funny payoffs. As Django finally pulls out what's in his coffin, the machine gun is likely a French mitrailleuse, also known as a volley gun, since it had many barrels that could be fired sequentially. It was used in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 71, but where did Django get his? Evidently there were some in Mexico. Mexican soldiers reportedly used them against the Yaqui Indians in the 1880s. But I think Corbucci employs it here for its surreal effect, another of the film's bizarrely poetic moments. Sam Peckinpah had a machine gun in The Wild Bunch. It's a very memorable prop, and I wonder if he saw this film or heard about it. He freely plagiarized material from other movies. Perhaps Corbucci's mitrailleuse became General Mapache's machine gun in The Wild Bunch. Django humiliates Jackson by putting him in blackface. Jackson hits the mud, and his face comes up as if with dark skin. Bacalov plays the moment for its significance. The white racist becomes what he most hates, and he flees in terror from Django's bullets, but also from the outrage of his humiliation. Turning into a black man fills Jackson with terror and rage. It's an inversion of the title of Frantz Fanon's famous book, Black Skin, White Masks. In this case, it's White Skin, Black Mask. It's a moment where Corbucci's contempt for the character comes through very strongly. Watching him go, Django feels some smug satisfaction. Now we survey the carnage. All these bodies in the street, their red hoods standing out and standing in for the bloodshed that we don't literally see on camera.
Anymore, Nathaniel?
You killed them all, didn't you?
Nathaniel disbelievingly says, "You killed them all."
The Mexican.
And Django says, "Almost all."
You can go to work now.
It's clear that Django has another purpose for Jackson to serve, and it's going to be one that suits Django's own selfish ends. Cemeteries are a good investment if you get paid up front. That's another element from Kurosawa's Yojimbo. Eventually, in that film, the killing becomes so plentiful that even the coffin maker goes out of business. Too many bodies means nobody worries over coffins.
His time hasn't come yet.
A nice fade, and we go into a very lovely scene. Bakalov's lonely horn plays in a muted fashion as Django gazes at the grave. And his melancholy is a feeling that is missing from Clint Eastwood's Man with No Name. Franco Nero is very elegant in this scene, in the way that he underplays Django's feelings without allowing the viewer to miss their significance. It's a very enigmatic scene. Who was this woman? Wife? Lover? Sister? We never know. Django merely says, "Someone who was part of my life." Corbucci is content to suggest, but not to state, to place a mystery at the heart of Django's anguish. Django's response to Nathaniel's question about whether Jackson and his men killed her seems evasive. He says that they did, but he seems to imply as well that it was not in the way that Nathaniel means. Mystery and enigma is the core of this film and its central character, and Sergio Corbucci calculated these things very well. These enigmas and their poetic force are one reason that the character of Django became so iconic and lived on in so many movies. It's because we don't know, because the questions are not answered, that Django is a haunting figure. Franco Nero gives a great performance, putting this over with restraint and great delicacy. Now Brother Jonathan screams a moral lecture at the prostitutes and condemns the reign of blood that has just befallen the town, even though he works for Jackson, collecting Jackson's dues from the whores and from Nathaniel. The anti-clericalism of Italian westerns is one of their most striking features. And Jonathan, this wormy, slimy little creature, enables Corbucci to draw a vivid portrait of the collusion between religion, political power, violence, and commerce, a pernicious alliance found almost everywhere, and one that harks back to Italy's fascist past. Gino Pernicia gives a fine performance, infusing Jonathan with a holy fervor that is outdone only by his craven opportunism in sucking up to power. In this respect, the character represents those elements in the Catholic Church that collaborated with the Italian fascists. Great shot there, the camera moving along with the group and the fence posts traveling in the immediate foreground. Now we've got the introduction of General Hugo, played by Jose Budallo, a boisterous, treacherous bandit come revolutionary. Corbucci used Jose Budallo again in basically the same role in his 1971 film, Compañeros. Budallo was a popular, prolific, hard-working actor who appeared often on television and the stage in addition to his film career. We've had a splendid entrance for Hugo and his assorted thugs, and Luis Bakalov's jaunty score added excitement and force to their entrance into the town. Corbucci's camera setups as Jonathan runs about and the group enters cut together in a very clear fashion. This is elegant classical filmmaking. Everything is very clear, and we know where everybody is in relation to all the others. The layout of the street and the characters is never confusing as we cut back and forth among everyone. So now the weasel Jonathan gets a splendid comeuppance. This is one of the scenes that led to the films being banned in the United Kingdom, where censors described the movie as having excessive and nauseating violence. Quentin Tarantino borrowed from Corbucci for a similar ear-cutting scene in Reservoir Dogs. In neither film do we actually see the cutting take place on camera, though Corbucci adds a deliciously grotesque touch when Hugo feeds it to Jonathan. Look how hemmed in there he looks. It's a great composition. All those guys surrounding him, and even the piece of the giant log in the foreground seems to slice diagonally down against him. So those ears have been spying for Major Jackson, and Budallo just slices one right off. We don't see it, but now it comes on camera, and he drops it into Pernicia's mouth. This moment coming up where Brother Jonathan is shot, is splendidly filmed. Look at this nice master shot. The camera pulls back in a deep focus shot, reaction, 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 shot, falls back, the camera moves in, and then we zoom in on Maria. A series of shots that tie into one another visually, graphically, and poetically. Here's another instance of Corbucci getting the maximum benefit from a master shot. These three members of Hugo's gang confront Django and Nathaniel at the cemetery. And we're not going to move into any closer shots until Django gets slugged.
You're Hugo's men, aren't you?
There. When he's on the ground, we then have a series of 2 shots and single close-ups. It's very nicely done. Hugo goes over there to threaten Maria, and he threatens to cut off one of her ears, and he tells her that he has every right to hold her prisoner, the same way that every man has over every woman that he loves. Now that's a sweeping assertion of male privilege and power, and when Maria says he sounds like one of Jackson's racists, he smacks her. This is one of the unfortunate aspects of many Euro Westerns. Westerns in general, whether they're American or European, are of course about male characters, and show a man's world in which women have limited roles and places. But whereas Hollywood Westerns often tended to idealize and sentimentalize their female characters, the Italian Westerns are more harsh and brutal toward them. They are often raped and smacked around, and the rapes might even be played as comedy, as Sergio Leone does in Duck You Sucker. In many films, this brutalization of women is taken for granted. It's an expression of patriarchal culture, and the way that Hugo understands it often seems like the way many filmmakers understand it. Of course, here, though, what's interesting is how Corbucci has Loredana Nusiak play Maria. She shows a lot of dignity and a stoic ability to bear up under conditions that she clearly objects to. I think Maria's dignity, stoicism, and strength might offer a critique of the patriarchy and the unthinking way that many Euro-Westerns celebrate it. By telling him he resembles Jackson's racists, Maria turns his attack around, directs it back at him by equating Hugo's hatred of women with Jackson's hatred for dark-skinned people. In each case, it is shown as irrational and a hateful response. Look at that nice profile shot of Franco Nero, and you can see the way that the hat just conforms to the lines and angles of his face. It's a very shrewdly chosen prop, that hat. That's a very tight close-up on Jose Badalo. See his scheming face. Django's going to lure him into this master plan to rob Fort Chiriba and get some extra guns. And this is going to facilitate Django's efforts to exact some revenge on Major Jackson. We've got another big unveiling of the mitrailleuse, the volley gun. The men gather around, intrigued. He pulls out his coffin, and he's going to take that gun out. And I wonder in this action that's coming up whether we have an homage to an older Hollywood movie. He takes that gun out and he's going to shred the walls of Nathaniel's bar with it. This scene resembles the one in the Warner Brothers gangster movie Scarface from 1931, where the gang boss Tony Camonte shows off a new Tommy gun and what it can do by firing it at the walls and fixtures in a pool hall. And just like there, in Django, we see bullet hits on the walls and bottles of Nathaniel's bar, but throughout the film, the actors are not squibbed to simulate bullet hits on their bodies. The destruction of the wall and the bottles stands in for what can't yet be shown, a depiction of similar damage being done to the human body. So instead of bloody bullet hits, in the Italian westerns of this period, we get characters doing elaborate pirouettes and falling bloodlessly to the ground. Hugo says that ours is a poor revolution. The time frame of the story is very unclear. Based on what Django says, it's a few years after the Civil War, but that is really too early for the Mexican Revolution to be underway. So Hugo may just be a small bandit trying to lead a local uprising, though he dresses himself up in a general's uniform and pretends to a larger revolution. However, it's very characteristic of Italian westerns to take an interest in revolution and in revolutionary politics. There were a great many communists and socialists working at Cinecittà, like Gian Maria Volante, one of the stars of Leone's first two movies, and who also appears in A Bullet for the General. Corbucci said there were numerous revolutionary meanings and references in his westerns. So the figure of Hugo evokes the strivings of Mexico's peasants and workers for economic justice, even as the movie cynically shows that Hugo is more interested in gold than in the poor. Django is the same way. He says, I care more about the gold than about whether Jackson lives or dies. This naked self-interest is ironic in Django's case because his name evokes the figure of Brazil's 24th president, João Goulart, who was nicknamed Django. Goulart was a left-wing politician who aimed as president to carry out land reforms and literacy programs that would benefit Brazil's poor. Predictably, Brazil's military viewed him as a communist, as did the United States. In 1964, the military seized power in a coup d'etat with the support of the United States and CIA. a familiar story. And in the years that followed, the military installed authoritarian leaders who restricted freedoms and civil rights and tortured and executed opposition figures. Brazil's Django, then, represented revolutionary aspirations that were snuffed out in a very dark period of that country's history. Django's name also evokes the gypsy jazz guitarist Django Reinhardt, who was a guitar virtuoso despite having a crippling injury to his left hand that left him able to play music using only 3 fingers on that hand. These are the 2 famous figures from whom Django takes his name. From one comes the virtuosic skill that he displays. From the other comes a dedication to social and economic justice, which remains a subtext of his character, one of its nuances. This is a splendid action sequence. It's crisp and tight and lean, extremely well focused. It doesn't waste time. And once the shooting begins, the scene takes less than 2 minutes of screen time for these guys to carry out their heist. This is a real virtue of fast filmmaking. You can get stuff without a lot of pretension, and it's crisp and focused. Hollywood movies used to be this way. One of the great things about Warner Brothers in the 1930s is that they were routinely making this kind of quick, fast-paced, lean filmmaking. The camera's always in the right place. The editing is crisp and clear. We know where everybody is. None of the action is confusing. It's elegantly staged. It moves along very swiftly. Get a little shootout on the rooftop up here. Franco Nero looks like he's in very good shape. He moves with great agility. Very smooth. And then they jump in the back of the wagon and they take off, and we're going to have a little chase scene across the desert. And if you look from shot to shot in this upcoming chase scene, you'll see that some of it was filmed with the second unit, and we don't always have our principal actors in their places. We've got some doubles. It all depends on which particular shot we're looking at. And then we've got some of these low-angle shots where we just see the actors in the coaches. There's clearly Edward Fajardo riding the horse in that long shot we just saw. But in some of the other shots showing the posse, he's going to be doubled. So it's movie magic at work. And these are all simulated shots. Now there, he's not on. Fajardo's not on the horse. It's an actor trying to keep the hat down to hide his face. Let's take advantage of this chase scene to talk a little bit about the evolution of the Euro Western. The Euro Western indeed was the natural successor to Hollywood's Westerns, and it arose because Hollywood was making fewer of them. The American studios released only 28 Westerns in 1960 compared with 130 10 years earlier. And by 1963, Hollywood's output had diminished down to a mere 11 Westerns. Italian audiences enjoyed Westerns and saw a great many of them after World War II. During the fascist era, they had been banned in Italy. After the war, they were back, but Hollywood's output had declined. In the U.S., Westerns were moving to television, where they became even more formulaic, sentimental, and ideological in their celebration of empire and manifest destiny. That said, however, I must confess that as a child growing up in the late 1950s and early 1960s, I loved the westerns that were on television. Rawhide, in particular, was my favorite. And if you were a boy growing up in the U.S. in that era, the western was it was what you played. You had toy guns and boots and hats, and it was a generational thing. Many of the Italian audiences felt similarly affectionate toward Hollywood westerns. Franco Nero, in particular, was extremely fond of westerns and was overjoyed in a way to get a chance to act in one. So, responding to this audience demand, Italian filmmakers and production companies stepped in and began to make westerns, often as Euro co-productions with Spanish and German participants. In the 1960s and 1970s, some 600 Euro westerns were made. This was a tremendous output. Inevitably, many were not really very distinguished, but altogether, they rewrote and re-envisioned the Hollywood western so decisively, and their commercial impact was so robust that Hollywood movies absorbed their style and began to emulate them. Many even began shooting on the same locations in Spain that the Italian westerns were using. In the late 1960s, Hollywood westerns grew rougher. Their depictions of frontier life became harder, more cynical, more sadistic, and more violent in films like The Wild Bunch, Soldier Blue, Ulzana's Raid, Valdez is Coming, Dirty Little Billy, and others. Some of this was due to the relaxation of censorship in the United States. By 1968, the censor boards were gone, and Hollywood's production code had been retired. In its place was a GMRX rating system that, for the first time, allowed filmmakers to aim specifically at adult audiences with material not suitable for children. But the biggest factor responsible for the new harshness in American westerns was the smashing success of Sergio Leone's Dollars trilogy upon its release in the U.S. in 1967. American audiences had never seen anything in a western like what Leone was showing them, and they wanted more. Giving them that is what brought Hollywood to the place where Sam Peckinpah found it possible to explode the moral coordinates of the genre in The Wild Bunch. The Euro-Western boom was a relatively short one, but innovative and influential periods in cinema tend to be brief ones. Italian neorealism, for example, lasted a mere 8 years. Leone's Fistful of Dollars in 1964 wasn't the first Euro-Western. Other Italian and German movies preceded it, but it was the success of Leone's film that triggered the big production boom. Numerous classics appeared in the next 4 years. Leone's other $2 films, plus Once Upon a Time in the West, Damiani's Bullet for the General, Corbucci's Django, The Great Silence, and A Professional Gun, Sergio Solima's The Big Gun Down and Face to Face, Questi's Django Kill, Tessari's A Pistol for Ringo and The Return of Ringo, and Parolini's Sartana. These are remarkable films, but the fact that they were westerns made in Europe tended to delegitimize them in the eyes of American critics. Nevertheless, they show that the most significant developments in the western and the most innovative use of this quintessentially American genre was taking place far outside of Hollywood. So now the gold is safely secured away, or so General Hugo thinks. Django, though, knows where it is, and he understands that his untrustworthy partner is about to cheat him. So that sets up a later plot development. Now this guy tries to put the moves on Maria, and she's not going to have any of it. So he gets mean with her, the way that these thugs often do in the Euro-Western. Maria's a pretty tough gal. She knocks him away, and Hugo intervenes. And we see some racial and ethnic animosity toward Django, that American bastard. Now we have a really splendid fight, brilliantly filmed. It does not look or feel like a standard Western barroom fight because Corbucci found inventive ways of handling it. He's got a lot of camera setups covering it from many angles, some at floor level, some up on the second floor of the bar looking down on the characters. There are so many setups that you can't anticipate in the editing where the shot changes will be. Many of the shots are locked down with the camera on a steady mounting, but others are handheld with noticeable jitter and wobble. Many of these are point-of-view shots as the camera bobs and weaves into and through the crowd, as if the camera were looking out at the assembly from inside of the fight. And best of all, the fight choreography is really clear. Despite all the fast cutting, there's no confusion about where people are and what they're doing. That's something movies today really ought to be better at doing. So we've got a splendid fight with elegant choreography and a really inventive visual design. Django gets about as good as he gives. He's got a worthy opponent. Another nice thing about the fight is that we don't have a lot of flimsy props, like chairs and other kinds of things being brought down on people's heads and breaking apart. That's something you see in a lot of these Western barroom fights, and it always looks a little bit silly. So the handheld camera work here adds a lot of energy to the fight. It makes it seem more vicious than it might otherwise. And now this poor guy gets impaled. On something he didn't know was there. And falls to the ground, and we can see that it's a pickaxe. Hugo says, "Yeah, Django, thank you. You saved my life again. I won't forget it, but these are empty promises." Again, Hugo offers Django Maria, and Django's motives and responses here are enigmatic. Once again, Corbucci has Nero play the character so that it's hard to know why he acts as he does. Why does Django refuse Hugo's offer of Maria? Django seems to spurn her. "She's not my type," he says. And he chooses instead the dark-skinned prostitute, which elicits the men's laughter of approval. Django's behavior is the second time that he has publicly disavowed a relationship, even a friendship, with Maria. He shamed her earlier when he made a big gesture of giving her back to Hugo. So why does he behave in this apparently cruel way? Perhaps it's as simple as his obsession with the gold being the only thing he cares about. An entanglement with Maria might threaten that. Or perhaps he holds the same beliefs in male power and prerogative as do Hugo and Major Jackson. If so, this makes his character quite one-dimensional. He becomes a kind of cardboard cutout figure, a stock character. But I think Nero's performance is too nuanced and careful for that. He's shown us that Django has a moral understanding of evil and of how the weak suffer when predators wield power. And he's shown us that Django understands what a world of violence has done to him, how it's damaged his life to a point where he sees himself as being sealed up on the inside of a coffin, being as good as dead. So maybe Django is protecting himself by disavowing Maria. Existing inside of a coffin that has, in a sense, become his temple of worship, this has grown safe. It's what he knows. Becoming entangled on whatever emotional level with another human being is threatening to his sense of self, to his psychological well-being, even though he carries a profound sense of loneliness, felt almost to the point of despair. It feels more dangerous to let some of that go than to continue carrying it. This is a sly joke. Django hoisting his coffin along the upstairs balcony, and then he's going to lower it down the ladder. This is one of Corbucci's best winks at the audience. That anyone would do this in the first place is crazy, and that Django could do it without making noise is also crazy. Of course, he's going to put the gold in it. That's his plan. His greed for the money now finds its poetic emblem in the coffin, the symbol of death. So down it goes. This is like something almost out of a slapstick comedy. Some of Corbucci's later westerns, like Compañeros and A Professional Gun, have a much stronger comic tone to them, and in some ways that gets in the way of the political messages that he might want to convey in those films. I think Django is such a fine film because everything is so well integrated in this movie. The outrageous violence blends very well with the sly humor, the dark jokes, and the film is so lean with no wasted scenes or time, and so condensed in the few locations that it has, that everything just moves along really splendidly. Now look at this great production design. We can see the underside of the coffin in these shots, and then again as he lowers it down further. Take a look at the underside of the coffin. You can see that it's scored deeply. The wood is etched and scratched. It's stained, maybe even damp with mildew and a certain rot, perhaps. It looks really weathered, gouged with abrasions. It truly looks like he's been dragging it for miles. That's great production design. Did Sam Peckinpah get the idea of portraying General Mapache's drunken revelry in the Wild Bunch from this film and those shots of General Hugo and his men carrying on? One doesn't know for sure, but it certainly would be possible. Peckinpah cribbed a lot of material in the Wild Bunch from other movies, including Robert Aldrich's Vera Cruz with Burt Lancaster and Gary Cooper, and most of all from John Huston's The Treasure of the Sierra Madre. A great many things in the Wild Bunch come from John Huston's Sierra Madre. Again, Django is being very enterprising in the way that a silent screen comic would be very enterprising at getting his needs met. Chaplin's Little Tramp was brilliant at finding ways to make the world conform to his needs, and would often do so using outlandish props in the way that Django is doing here. In fact, one of the gag structures that Chaplin often relied upon was the principle of transposition, as his biographer David Robinson has pointed out. Chaplin would treat one object as if it were another, as in the famous scene in The Gold Rush when he cooks and eats his boot for Thanksgiving dinner. He finds the properties of food in the various elements of the boot. That's not so far removed from what Corbucci is doing with Django's coffin throughout this movie. The coffin contains a weapon. Why shouldn't the coffin, an instrument of death, house a weapon? It's a rather Chaplin-esque gag. While the Chaplin connection seems a likely possibility for Corbucci and Django, we know that it is a definite certainty for Sergio Leone and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Leone stated that he based his characters and storyline in that film on Chaplin's film Monsieur Verdoux, taking the sense of irony and black humor from that film and importing it into his vision of the West. And while we're being perhaps a little bit obsessive about pursuing this line of interest, it's also worth noting that Chaplin's son, Sidney Chaplin, appeared in a film directed by Sergio Corbucci's brother, Bruno Corbucci, in 1970, a comedy. So if Chaplin and his comedy furnished a certain template for Leone and Corbucci, it's because there is something very essential about Chaplin and his connection to cinema. So much of what he did on screen has become fundamental to many other filmmakers. Sergio Leone used this idea of gold in a coffin and in a graveyard in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Filmmaker Alex Cox has suggested that these motifs of weapons in a casket or a grave might be an allusion to a plan that was hatched during the Cold War to install secret commando groups throughout Italy and other European countries who would be active resistance and terrorist units in the event of a Soviet invasion. Hundreds of arms caches were secretly buried around the country, some apparently in cemeteries. Although the plan sounds outlandish, it was for real, and Corbucci's social antenna might well have seized on the idea of guns being buried inside of graves or coffins as a striking visual idea that would do well in a Western. You would not be advised to try this, because in a movie, our hero can assume that the blast is going to direct outward and he won't be harmed. But it seems like a leap of faith. We've got a nice visual effect with that volley gun sparking in series like that. Django drags it out. Corbucci and Franco Nero get a lot of mileage out of that coffin. One of the unwritten rules of Westerns in this period is that horses don't get hurt. Well, there we just saw one fall, but probably not injured too badly. Now Maria's going to join him. She's quite an enterprising character. And she's got a gun. In general, in Hollywood Westerns, you don't see women with guns. She also knows how to shoot it. At the end of High Noon, the hero's Quaker wife picks up a gun and shoots the chief villain in the back. And that's rather unusual for a Hollywood picture in that period. The notable exception, of course, is Nicholas Ray's Johnny Guitar, where the climactic gunfight is between two women with pistols strapped on their hips. Ray was interested in pushing the boundaries of the Western, and he was one of the notable figures who did that in that era. Johnny Guitar was an influential film in Europe, and so it may have exerted some distant influence over Corbucci's decision about what to do with the character of Maria and her proficiency with a firearm. Now that's great graphic design. The spindly bridge and the cut here to these skeletal supports. The last act now unfolds extremely swiftly. As I've said, the narrative economy of this movie is like a great Warner Brothers film of the 1930s. The storytelling is swift, tight, sure, and economical, qualities that many theatrical films today would do well to emulate. "It's time for me to cross that bridge," he says. Nero's dialogue here is again very enigmatic. What does that bridge he's going to cross represent? A new life? Letting go of the old? Burying his old self in the coffin? If so, that bridge looks pretty treacherous, unlikely to support anybody's weight trying to cross it. He's as likely as the coffin to end up in the bog, which indeed is what's going to happen. Maria confesses her love, and Django says, "I've left that behind a long time ago. It's under that cross in the Tombstone Cemetery." He refuses her offer, her good offer, preferring instead to pursue his own plans himself. But fate takes a hand and intervenes. The gun discharges, the horse panics, the coffin and its gold go into the bog. It's a cruel universe, laughing at the efforts of human beings to control their destiny, mocking their efforts. There's a cosmological view of reality here that Corbucci treats with black humor as a sly joke. It's a comical outcome for Django to jump into that bog and then get trapped, being pulled under by the coffin that he's been dragging through the movie. So again, Maria comes to his rescue, pulling him up. And this becomes a transformative moment for Django, as we find out later on. And a shocking narrative twist. Maria is gunned down as she saves Django from his own foolishness. Hugo's men pull him out. That's a nice shot with the two tiers of men up on the top of the rise and then down below. Look at the way they encircle him. Again, a great composition that plays really well in the 1.66 to 1 ratio. Nice handheld shot there from Django's point of view. Now we have a kind of philosophical exchange that touches on the nature of free will. Django stoically tells him that the mud swallowed up. A horse rears, a coffin slides, the gold is gone. It's fate, General.
And so, my gold's in the quicksand, amigo.
Hugo doesn't believe that. It'll take more than lost gold to change my fate, amigo. Hugo asserts this, but very shortly fate will visit a grand and deadly joke on him. Hugo says, I'm not going to kill you. We don't kill thieves. Instead, he's got something far more diabolical in mind, and it becomes one of the film's great set pieces, one of the most memorable instances of the florid and flamboyant violence that the Euro Westerns were practicing. This is the great, grandiloquent torture scene. Django's hands are broken first by rifle butt and then by horses' hooves, and all for the sake of the revolution and for gold. There's an interesting tradition of mutilating someone's hands in Westerns that Corbucci is drawing on and deliriously surpassing. In The Man from Laramie, Alex Nichol tortures James Stewart by blowing a hole through his hand with a gun at close range. In One-Eyed Jacks, corrupt Sheriff Carl Malden smashes Marlon Brando's hand with the butt of a rifle. In Duel at Diablo, James Garner drives a knife through a man's hand, pinning it to the top of a desk. As sadistic as these things are, they don't come close to what Corbucci shows us being done to Django. His hands are being smashed so severely that it seems unlikely he'll ever be able to hold a gun again, which makes the film's last scene, the gunfight in the graveyard, seem like a resurrection for Django. Hugo promises Django that they'll meet again in hell. That line might be lifted from Kurosawa's Yojimbo. The dying villain in that film tells the samurai hero just before he expires, "I'll see you in hell." It's a taunt from the villain that suggests that he and the hero are essentially alike and will therefore end up in the same place, namely hell. But I think that this film is rather different. Corbucci is not suggesting that Django and Hugo are essentially the same kind of person. In fact, the end of the film hinges on Django's discovery that he is morally quite different from Major Jackson. And we will see that Django attains a certain real honor and redemption. Here's a great shot. It starts like a standard establishing shot showing Hugo and gang on the move, but then the camera zooms back to reveal the Mexican soldiers waiting in ambush. And the zoom continues to reveal Major Jackson looming ominously in profile. Two reveals in the shot eloquently conveyed in visual terms. Pure visual storytelling. Jackson looms above in the rocks in a way that speaks about his power. He's working both sides of the border with alliances on each, and he's got the Mexican army there to do his bidding. He seems to accept their dark skins so long as it serves his ends. So his racial ideology is not an absolute one, because to achieve his goals, he's willing to ally himself with members of groups whom he professes to hate. The buckskins that he's wearing are an interesting touch. In American Westerns, they're a sign of the frontier, and characters who wear them, like Shane, are wilderness figures, at home in the wild. Now Jackson is hardly that sort. He seems accustomed to nice things and a cushy way of living. So maybe the buckskins here, in the context of a Euro-Western, are meant to denote the United States, where Western mythology originates, and that its presence and power have extended through Jackson into Mexico. It's Jackson who fired the first shot. He's in control, and the Mexican army is following his bidding. And it's Jackson who executes General Hugo. He fires at least 3 bullets to get the job done, and Hugo dies like a pathetic tin pot figure, reaching for his sword, his idea of what a general ought to do at such a time. So the killing is not simple vengeance on Jackson's part, it's an economic transaction with the Mexican army. Getting rid of Hugo will open more markets and resources for Jackson, and give him a bigger base for his racist campaign. It's all handled with admirable speed, skill, and economy by Corbucci. There's no squibbing of the actors, so the hail of bullets produces little or no blood, and the horses are never hit by all of the bullets. In westerns of this era, they never are. The audio library of gun sounds that Corbucci is drawing on seems to be quite limited. Here and elsewhere in the film, we hear the same audio clips again and again whenever a rifle or pistol is fired. We went out of the scene with a lingering close-up of Jackson's smug face, the face of power, the face of the establishment that Corbucci understood as a left-wing filmmaker and opposed. Organized political power rarely seemed to work for the interests of the poor, and the implicit political parable that he constructs in Django is about exposing and destroying that establishment. Corbucci returned to this theme again in The Great Silence, and there made it more explicit, but also far more despairing. Django at least triumphs over Jackson, but The Great Silence ends with the death of all the decent and sympathetic characters, even the hero, at the hands of the hired killers who represent the interests of the wealthy. Nathaniel is very melancholy. He's alone with the things that he loves, his books, his violin, the piano. He is, in his way, a cultured man, but his world is threatened by Jackson and by what he represents, and Nathaniel now has to leave, say goodbye to these things if he is to live. The dignity and sadness that Alvarez evokes in the character adds deep feeling to this scene and to what is about to happen. In comes Django, covered with mud, carrying Maria with his broken hands. And this is Nathaniel's moment of moral awakening. He's been kind of a shrewd opportunist throughout the movie and has not been terribly eager to lend Django any assistance. But now when he's called upon to do so, he rises to the occasion. And Alvarez does a nice job at conveying Nathaniel's hesitancy, but also his resolution to help. He warns them that Jackson could be back. They need to get out. Django realizes that it's necessary for him to kill Jackson. It's necessary for him in an existential sense, so that he can at last be free of the past, can redeem his life, and begin living like a human being. But necessary also in a larger sense for society, so that the town might begin to live again. Corbucci gives Franco Nero tight close-ups, and his eyeline is very close to the camera, nearly as if the character were addressing the audience. Django realizes that you have finally to take a stand on behalf of something larger than yourself, that you have finally to stand and fight to the end. In terms of the film's political subtext, it's an awakening, probably the first that Django has had since he joined the war on behalf of the anti-slavery cause. And it's linked to Maria and her selfless gesture in trying to save Django from the quicksand. Her effort has stirred his conscience. His need to act has become a categorical imperative. It's unconditional and necessary and not dependent on any ulterior motive. It's political action grounded in moral necessity. So for all of the film's surrealism and brutal violence, Corbucci anchors his story in a moral framework that becomes overwhelmingly important in this last act. Look at this splendid deep focus shot. Fajardo puts on the red scarf. And this splendid deep focus shot with the tree in the immediate foreground and the men in the distant background. Vast sense of space, moving on a diagonal toward the camera, creating an onrushing sense of tension and impending confrontation. And the ritualized nature of the build-up is apparent in the way Corbucci allows them to make this walk and holds the frame. One of the great things about movies in this period is that directors were not afraid to let action play at a distance from the camera. Today, everything's in close-up because viewing screens have gotten small and mobile. And so this ability to play to a large screen and put action back from the camera seems to be somewhat lost in contemporary cinema. Again, the action here is going to be swift and decisive and brutal. They wear red hoods, but they might as well have on the brown shirts of Hitler's SA or the black shirts of the paramilitary wing of Mussolini's National Fascist Party. They have the same disdain for the privacy of the home or the sanctity of the individual. This home invasion and the execution that follows resonate deeply with what was, when the film was made, relatively recent European history. Alvarez is going to try to deflect them by telling them the truth, that Django is not there, that he'll meet them in the graveyard. But note that Nathaniel has also positioned himself away from the couch, where Jackson is less likely to see Maria. I think Nathaniel knows that his time is over, and he goes to his end very stoically. Now we move to one of the most extraordinary endings in any Western ever. A moving camera shot brings us into the cemetery and gives us a slow reveal of Django at the cross in the distance. Crippled, desperate, biting off the trigger guard of his pistol so that he can get his swollen and damaged fingers around the trigger. These shots of the cemetery from Django's point of view look almost like a horror film. There's a certain kind of blending of genres that often you find in the Euro Westerns, and horror is one of those genres that was most commonly blended into the Western. That's a very spooky looking graveyard, and the sense of the spookiness of it is accentuated by the howling of the distant animal. The camera zooms out. That's an expressionistic touch that you see in Universal horror films of the 30s, that angular looming grave marker there on a diagonal. The dates on the grave that Django is hugging, which bears the name Mercedes Zarro, the dates are very strange. The first one looks like 1833, which has been recarved as 1873, and the second one reads 1889, which seems to have been recarved from 1881. 1889 is weirdly late, given that Django, by his own account, is only a few years out of the Civil War. 1889 is nearly 25 years after the end of the war, which would put Django in his 50s. So this is simply not possible. And here they come. Corbucci is not going to overplay things. He's not going to milk them out. He's going to give it to us swiftly and surely and economically. Django can barely get the gun lifted up. It seems unlikely that he'll be able to prevail. That he does prevail, and that it happens in the graveyard at the gravesite, gives it the quality of a resurrection. And here comes Jackson, silhouetted against the gray, wintry sky, the skeletal trees. This scene is fast, splendidly visual, and stunningly anti-clerical, with Jackson invoking the Holy Trinity as he fires his bullets at Django. Italian fascism was the first fascist movement to attain power, and did so in an overwhelmingly Catholic country. Corbucci may intend for Jackson's recitation of the Holy Trinity to be a reminder of the collusion between the Church and the fascists during that era. His recitation of the Holy Trinity commandeers religion into the service of violence. He represents a corrupt union of state power, religion, and business, acting in concert and using violence against their perceived enemies. Although the film's Western time frame is the 19th century, Jackson is a demon from the more recent past, from the Depression era and war years that spawned fascism. Jackson is the specter of fascism, which continues to haunt our world today and to divide it, aiming to turn all into a fellow fascist, an enemy, or a slave. Thus, Corbucci's parable remains very timely and an urgent warning about an ever-present danger. As Jackson has said, he and his forces will never give up. Their war will never end. But happily, as in Kurosawa's Yojimbo, Corbucci gives us a comic fantasy in which the hero, weakened and beaten, improbably triumphs over evil. Django shouts, "Così sia," Amen, and fires from behind a cross, directing a righteousness against Jackson and his forces that annihilate all. Now it'll be quiet in this town. And Django, like all true Western heroes, must walk, or ride, off into legend, away from us, because he is, after all, a kind of demigod, not part of our world. The magnificent final shot is one of the film's few crane shots. The camera booms down to the grave and the cross in the near foreground. As Django moves away into the deep focus distance and into cinema history and legend. The camera move reveals the pistol lying atop the cross, with Django's blood on the pistol grip. Django has made a blood sacrifice for all, has attained the purification that he has been seeking. He no longer needs the pistol, and the image suggests that he has left violence behind now forever. But another 30 Django movies will tell us differently. Thank you.